I watched my son stand up in front of his sister's entire graduation class and hold up my diploma. He was smiling. The room went quiet in that specific way, the way it goes quiet when everyone is wondering if what they just saw was real. He tore it in half. Then he looked at me and said, "That's what I think of your legacy, Dad." I didn't answer. I finished my coffee. What he didn't know was that I'd already made a phone call that morning, and the person on the other end of that call was going to change everything about the next 6 months of his life. My name is Richard Calloway. I'm 62 years old, and I have spent 41 years in structural engineering, 38 of them in the field, 3 of them paying $40 to $200 a semester in 1983 tuition money I earned on weekends consulting for a firm in Cambridge, because that was what the master's degree cost, and I was not willing to go without it. For the past 14 years, I've taught structural engineering at MIT, which is a sentence that still surprises me sometimes, because I spent the first 38 years of my working life in the field, not in a classroom. I started as a junior site engineer in 1984, the year after I finished my undergraduate degree, and I worked construction projects up and down the eastern seaboard for nearly 4 decades. Bridges, drainage systems, a water treatment facility in Worcester that I'm still quietly proud of. The kind of work where you spend your Tuesday mornings in rubber boots in a drainage ditch and your Thursday evenings reading load calculations by lamplight because the deadline doesn't care about the weather. The master's degree came in 1985. I was 24, working full-time, and I took evening classes at Northeastern for 2 years to finish it. My wife Margaret drove me to campus on Tuesday and Thursday nights because we had one car, and she didn't want me taking the T at 11 o'clock with a briefcase full of structural analysis papers. We didn't have money for much in those years. The program cost more than we could easily afford, and I picked up weekend consulting work for a small firm in Cambridge to cover the tuition. The degree itself, the physical document, sat in a cardboard tube in our closet for 3 years before Margaret finally had it framed. She chose a dark walnut frame with a cream mat. She said it deserved better than cardboard. That framed diploma hung in my office at home for 37 years. Michael grew up in that house. He walked past that office every day of his childhood. He is 25 now. He graduated last spring with a degree in computer engineering from Northeastern, the same university where I earned my master's, which is either ironic or irrelevant depending on how you look at it. His GPA was strong. He interviewed well. He had the kind of confidence in a room that reads as competence until you've known someone long enough to see the difference. I had known him his entire life, and I had seen the difference. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want to paint Michael as a cartoon. He was not a bad person in every direction. He was funny when he wanted to be. He remembered birthdays. He called his grandmother every Sunday until she died in 2019. There were good things in him. There still are, I think. But there was also something in him that needed to be the most capable person in the room, and when the room contained me, that need had a particular edge to it. He started calling me old school around the time he turned 20. Not as a compliment. He said it the way people say out of touch, as a kind of gentle dismissal that doesn't require evidence. He told his friends I didn't understand modern engineering. He told Sarah, his sister, that my career had been about moving dirt, which was not entirely wrong, but was delivered in a tone designed to make 38 years of work sound like a hobby. I didn't argue with him about it. I've been in enough rooms with enough engineers to know that the people who most need to announce their superiority are usually the ones most uncertain of it. I said nothing. I let him talk. 2 years ago, in the spring semester of his junior year, I was reviewing a paper he'd submitted for an independent study he was doing under a professor I knew at Northeastern. The professor had sent it to me informally, as a favor, because Michael had listed me as a reference, and she wanted a second opinion on the technical sections. I read the paper. Halfway through the appendix, I recognized a block of code. Not vaguely recognized, specifically recognized. I had seen that exact code 3 weeks earlier in a GitHub repository that a former student of mine had mentioned in a seminar. The repository was public. The code was uncredited. The methodology section that followed it was presented as Michael's original work. I didn't confront him. I called the professor and told her what I'd found. She thanked me and said she would handle it internally. Then I made a copy of the paper, the GitHub repository page, and the timestamps that showed the repository had been created 4 months before Michael's submission date. I put everything in a folder. I put the folder in the filing cabinet in my office. I didn't tell Michael. I didn't tell Margaret, who had died the previous year and was past the point of being told anything. I said nothing. I just filed it. The incident was noted. It was handled quietly within the department. Michael received a warning and was required to resubmit. He passed. He graduated. He applied for an engineering position at Harland & Voss, a firm in Boston's Seaport District that does infrastructure consulting, the kind of work I spent my career doing, which I suspect was not coincidental. James Whitfield, his closest friend from college, applied to the same firm at the same time. They were both in the final round of interviews. 1 week before Sarah's graduation dinner, Michael came to my house to pick up some boxes he'd left in the garage. We talked in the kitchen for about 15 minutes, the kind of conversation that covers weather and logistics and not much else. As he was leaving, he stopped at the back door and turned around. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he said, "I'm going to do something at Sarah's party that you won't forget." He said it quietly, almost pleasantly, the way you'd mentioned you were planning to bring wine. Then he left. I stood in the kitchen for a while after he drove away. The coffee I'd been making finished brewing. I poured a cup and drank half of it before I picked up the phone. "Dr. Patricia Chen is the Dean of Engineering at the university where Harland & Voss had recently established a recruitment partnership, a detail I knew because I served on an advisory committee that had helped structure that partnership 18 months earlier. I had met Patricia at 3 or 4 professional events over the years. She was precise, unhurried, and not easily impressed. She answered on the second ring. I told her I had information relevant to a candidate in her pipeline. I told her I would not be making a formal complaint at this time, but that I believed she should be aware of certain documented facts before any final hiring decisions were made. I read her the dates. I described the repository. I told her where the folder was and offered to scan and send its contents that evening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I appreciate you calling. Richard, I'll look at whatever you send, and I'll be paying close attention to what happens in the next few days." She paused. "Thank you for the warning." I told her she was welcome. I hung up. Then I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink, rinsed the cup, and went to get dressed for Sarah's graduation dinner. The restaurant was called Meridian. It sat on the waterfront in the Seaport District, 12 minutes from my house by car. Sarah had chosen it herself. She'd saved up for months to contribute to the cost, which was the kind of thing Sarah did. 30 guests were expected. The private dining room had tall windows facing the harbor, and the light at that hour came in flat and silver off the water. I arrived early enough to find the room still being arranged, white tablecloths going down, small cards being placed at each seat. A young woman named Delia, who was coordinating the event for the restaurant, asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine. I found my seat, set my jacket over the back of the chair, and watched the harbor for a few minutes before anyone else arrived. Michael came in with James Whitfield about 20 minutes later. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark gray, well-fitted, the kind of thing you wear when you want to be noticed. He scanned the room when he entered, the way people do when they're calculating an audience. His eyes found me at the table. He smiled, not warmly. It was the smile of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and is pleased with the decision. My diploma, in its walnut frame, was leaning against the wall near the door. I hadn't brought it. I had no idea how it had gotten there. I looked at it for a moment, then looked at Michael. He had already looked away. I picked up the menu and read it from the beginning. He stood up between the salad course and the entree. The timing was deliberate. Enough wine had moved around the table that people were relaxed, talking in the loose way that happens when a celebration has been going for 2 hours and everyone has decided it's going well. Sarah was in the middle of a story about her thesis advisor, The woman to my left, one of her classmates. I hadn't caught her name, was laughing. The room held maybe 30 people, spread across 4 tables, and the noise level had settled into that comfortable hum that makes a restaurant feel full without feeling crowded. Michael stood, and the hum didn't stop immediately. It tapered. One table noticed, then another. Sarah's story trailed off. The woman to my left stopped laughing and looked up. He had the frame in his hands, the walnut frame that had been leaning against the wall near the door when he walked in. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has started that no one quite understands yet, not silence exactly, but a held breath, a collective decision to wait and see. "I want to say something," Michael said. His voice was even, projected, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. "About education, about what we're actually celebrating tonight." He looked at Sarah when he said it, but he wasn't talking to her. "Dad always said that a degree is everything, that a piece of paper is what separates the serious people from everyone else." He paused. He had learned, somewhere, the value of a pause. "I used to believe that." He turned the frame over in his hands. Then he unlatched the back, the small brass clips that held the backing in place, and slid my diploma out. 41 years old. That paper. The university seal in the upper left corner, faded to a pale blue, my name in the center, in the typeface that MIT used in 1983 before they changed it. He held it up so the table could see it. Sarah said, "Michael." He talked over her, not loudly, just steadily. "It's a piece of paper, that's all it is. And I think it's time we were honest about that." He tore it in half. The sound was small. Paper tearing doesn't make the sound people expect. It's quieter than that. Softer. Almost domestic, the sound of something being opened rather than destroyed. But the room registered it. I watched it move through the faces around the table. The moment of comprehension. The recalibration of what kind of evening this had turned into. He tore it again. 4 pieces now. He set them on the table in front of him, spread them slightly with one hand, the way you'd arrange something you wanted people to look at. "I start at Meridian Engineering in 3 weeks, he said. "The salary is 3 times what my father has made in any single year of his career. I didn't need a master's degree for that. I needed to be good at what I do." James Whitfield, sitting 2 seats to my left, had gone very still. He was looking at the pieces of paper on the table. His glass was halfway to his mouth and had stopped there. The woman to my right, Michael's mother, Carol, my ex-wife of 11 years, was watching me. She had a small smile, the kind that isn't quite a smile, the kind that's actually a decision not to intervene. She looked at me the way you look at something you've already assessed and moved past. I had seen that expression before. The last time was in a mediator's office in 2019 when she told the mediator that I had always prioritized my work over my family and that this was simply a fact, not an accusation. I looked down at my coffee cup. The coffee was still warm. I had ordered it black, and the restaurant had brought it in a white ceramic cup that was heavier than it looked. I picked it up with both hands and drank a small amount. The coffee was good, better than I'd expected from a place that charged this much for a salad. Sir," James's voice was quiet, directed at me. Are you okay?" I set the cup down. I looked at him. He was 25 years old, same as Michael, and he had the expression of someone who had just watched a car accident and wasn't sure yet if anyone was hurt. His eyes moved between me and the pieces of paper on the table and back to me. I shook my head slightly. Not to answer his question, just to indicate that there was nothing he needed to do. Michael was still standing. He had picked up his wine glass and was holding it loosely, the way you hold a glass when you're done using it as a prop but haven't decided where to put it. "I'm not saying this to be cruel," he said, which is what people say when they are being cruel and would prefer not to be called that. "I'm saying it because I think it's true. The world has changed. The metrics have changed. And I think Dad, more than anyone, needs to hear that." Carol looked at me again. The small smile hadn't moved. She lifted her own glass and drank. Sarah was looking at her plate, Her hands were flat on the table, and she was pressing them down in the way people press their hands down when they are working very hard not to do something with them. The 30 people in that room were quiet in the specific way that 30 people go quiet when they have all individually decided that the right thing to do is wait. No one was going to say anything. No one was going to stand up. This was Michael's moment, and the room had given it to him, and now it was just a matter of how long he wanted to hold it. He set his glass down. He looked at me directly, for the first time since he'd started speaking. "You worked your whole life for that," he said, nodding toward the pieces of paper, "and I'm going to surpass it in the first 6 months." I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the coffee cup. Then I looked at James, who was still watching me with that careful, uncertain expression. "Would you pass the bread?" I said to James. He blinked. He looked at the bread basket. He passed it. I took a piece of bread and set it on my plate. Michael remained standing for another few seconds. Then he sat down. The room began, slowly, to breathe again. The party ended the way those parties always end in stages. The caterers began clearing the outer tables first, stacking plates with the practiced efficiency of people who had witnessed 100 family celebrations and knew better than to make eye contact with anyone. Sarah's friends gathered near the door, exchanging phone numbers and promises to keep in touch that most of them would half keep. The older relatives found their coats. By 9:30, the main room had emptied to 12 people, and by 10, it was just family. I helped fold the cloth napkins. It was something to do with my hands. Michael left before I did. I watched him from across the room as he shook a few hands, accepted a few congratulations that weren't meant for him, and moved toward the exit with the particular confidence of a man who believed the evening had gone exactly as planned. James followed 2 steps behind, the way he usually did, not quite a shadow, but close enough. The drive home took 22 minutes. I counted the stoplights. There were 7. Us. What James said to Michael in the parking lot, I learned later not from James, and not from Michael, but from the kind of incidental accounting that happens when a story has enough moving parts. James had parked 2 rows over from Michael's car. They stood between the vehicles in the October cold. Michael still wearing the slight elevation of a man who had just done something he'd been planning for a while. "I did it," Michael said. He wasn't smiling exactly. It was something smaller than a smile, more private. He's going to remember that for the rest of his life. James said he didn't respond right away. He was looking at the entrance to the restaurant, where the last of the guests were still filtering out. "Your dad," James said finally. He didn't react. Michael shrugged. "That's who he is." "No," James said. "I mean, he really didn't react. He asked me to pass the bread." Michael said something about weakness. He said it the way people say things they've been telling themselves for a long time, not as an argument, but as a fact that had stopped requiring proof. His father was a man who absorbed things and didn't push back. That was the whole point. That was why it had worked. James said he nodded. He got in his car. But he told me later, weeks later, when everything had already unfolded, that he sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before he drove away. Something about the bread. Something about the way I had looked at him before I asked for it. Not angry. Not hurt. Patient, he said, like a man waiting for a bus he knew was coming. 2 days later, James's phone rang at 11 in the morning. He was at his apartment in Cambridge, still in the early rounds of the application process for the engineering position at Aldrich Mercer, the same firm Michael had been targeting since his junior year. The number was a 617 area code he didn't recognize. The woman identified herself as Karen Whitfield from the firm's talent acquisition office. Her voice was professionally neutral in the way that HR voices learn to be not warm, not cold, calibrated to convey information without conveying judgment. She said, "I'm calling regarding the joint application cohort from this past September. We've completed our initial review and will be moving forward with most candidates. However, I wanted to reach out personally because there's a situation with one of your cohort members, Michael Alderton. We won't be continuing with his application at this time. There are some items in his file that need to be clarified before we can proceed." James said he stood up from his chair when she said it. "What kind of items?" he asked. Karen Whitfield said she wasn't able to go into detail, but that the firm had been contacted by the university specifically, by the dean's office, regarding some concerns about academic integrity in Michael's record. She said the firm took those communications seriously. She said she was sorry to be delivering the news indirectly, but she wanted James to be aware in case he had questions about his own application, which remained active. James called Michael before he'd even hung up with Karen Whitfield. Michael picked up on the second ring. James told him what had happened. There was a pause, not a long one, but the kind of pause that contains a calculation. "That's a mistake," Michael said. "I'll call them." He called. Karen Whitfield's assistant put him through after a 10-minute hold. Michael explained that there must be a misunderstanding, that his academic record was clean, that he'd graduated with distinction. Karen Whitfield listened. Then she said, carefully and without apology, "Mr. Alderton, the dean of your college, contacted us directly. She indicated there are concerns about academic integrity in your file that weren't resolved before graduation. Until those are clarified through the appropriate channels, we can't move forward. I'm sorry." Michael said it was a mistake. He said he didn't know what the dean could possibly have communicated. He said he would sort it out. He hung up and sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. Because he did know, that was the thing he couldn't say to Karen Whitfield, couldn't say to James when James called back an hour later to ask what was happening. Michael knew exactly what the dean might have communicated because there was exactly one thing in his academic record that had never been formally addressed, a problem that had existed for 2 years in the quiet space between what had happened and what had been officially documented. The spring semester of his junior year, a systems design assignment. He had lifted substantial portions of the code from a repository that wasn't his, not wholesale, but enough. Restructured enough to pass a casual review, but not a careful one. He had submitted it. He had received a grade. No one had said anything. Except that wasn't entirely true. One person had seen the assignment before he submitted it. One person had looked at the code, looked at him, and said nothing, not to the department, not to the university, not to anyone. Just looked at him with that same patient expression and let it pass. His father had been helping him debug a separate project that weekend. Michael had left the window open on his laptop. He hadn't thought about it at the time. He'd told himself his father hadn't understood what he was looking at. Standing in his apartment 2 days after the graduation party, Michael understood that his father had understood exactly what he was looking at. He had simply waited. James called again that evening. "What's going on?" he asked. "The dean called them. Michael, how does the dean know anything?" Michael didn't answer right away. Outside his window, the Charles River was flat and gray in the late afternoon light. He thought about a breadbasket. He thought about a man who had looked at him across a table full of people and chosen, very deliberately, to ask for bread. "I don't know," Michael said. But his voice had changed. James heard it. He told me later that was the moment he started to understand that the evening at the restaurant had not, in fact, gone the way Michael believed it had gone. The dean had called, the file had been flagged, the application was on hold, and Richard Alderton had asked for bread. Michael called me at 7:14 in the evening. I know the time because I was grading problem sets at my desk, third-year structural mechanics, the same course I'd been teaching for 19 years, and I noted it in the margin of the page I was holding when the phone rang. A habit from the old days. You write down when things happen. He didn't start with hello. He said, "Dad, why did you talk to the dean? I was just trying to make a point. I didn't think you'd take it this seriously." I let that sit for a moment. Outside my office window, the last of the evening light was catching the brick of the building across the courtyard, the engineering library, where I'd spent more hours than I could count, where Michael had spent exactly none. I looked at the margin note, 7:14. I didn't tell Dr. Chen about the diploma. I told her about what I've known for 2 years. The silence on his end was different from the silence I'd held at the restaurant. His was the silence of a person trying to reconstruct a conversation they thought they'd understood. Mine had been something else entirely. "What do you mean?" he said. "What do you know?" "Everything, Michael." I kept my voice the same as it always was. Not cold, not warm. The same. "I've always known. I was just waiting to see what you'd do with it." Then I hung up. He called back twice. I didn't answer. I went back to the problem sets. The third-year students had been working on load distribution across asymmetrical spans, a tricky problem, one where the obvious solution is almost always wrong. I finished grading at 840. What Michael did next, I know partly from James and partly from his mother, who called me 2 days later. He sat with his phone for a while after I hung up. Then he called Linda. Linda and I had been divorced for 11 years. We had worked out, over a long time and with considerable difficulty, a way of being civil to each other. She knew things about me that Michael didn't know she knew. She was not, despite what Michael had apparently assumed, someone who could be recruited into his corner simply because she was his mother. He asked her whether she had known I'd spoken to Dr. Chen. He asked it in a way that suggested he expected her to be surprised, to be outraged on his behalf, to confirm that I had overreacted to a small thing. She told me later what she said to him. She said, "I don't know what your father said to the dean or why, but Michael, your father is not a passive man. He never has been. He just doesn't announce himself." She said he went quiet at that. She said she could hear him breathing. He knew something. Michael told her. He said he's known for 2 years. Linda paused. Then she said, "Then I'd think very carefully about what that means." She didn't tell him more than that. She called me afterward, not to warn me or to intervene, but because she thought I should know how the conversation had gone. She said, before she hung up, "Whatever you're doing, Richard, be sure it's the right thing." I told her I was sure. She said she believed me, and that was why she was worried. James told me his version a week later, over coffee in my office. He'd been trying to reach Michael all that evening, and Michael hadn't picked up. He said Michael finally texted him around 10 o'clock. "Something's wrong. I think my dad knew about the thesis thing." James had asked what he meant. Michael hadn't answered until the next morning. By then, James had already started thinking back through the dinner at the restaurant, the bread basket, the way I had looked at Michael when Michael held up the diploma. Not shocked, not hurt. Something else. Something James said he hadn't had a word for at the time, but that he had a word for now. "Ready." That was what he said, sitting across from me in my office with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands. "You looked ready, Professor Alderton, like you'd already seen it happen." I didn't confirm or deny that. I asked him how his own application was progressing. He said it was still under review. I told him that was normal for this stage of the process, and that he should make sure his references were submitted. He nodded. He was a careful young man. He'd always done his own work. He left my office, and I sat for a while. On my desk was a folder I'd been keeping for 8 months, not because I'd planned to use it at any particular moment, but because I had learned, long ago, that the question is never whether information matters. The question is always when. Michael had assumed I was the kind of man who could be humiliated into silence. He had mistaken patience for weakness, and silence for surrender. Those are easy mistakes to make about someone who doesn't correct them. I picked up my pen and went back to the problem sets. There were 6 left. 8 months earlier, before the party, before the diploma, before any of it, I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning grading midterms when Michael's voice came through the wall. He was in the living room, on his phone. The voice was the particular kind of loud that people use when they're performing for whoever is listening on the other end, not when they're simply talking. I recognized the register. I'd spent 31 years in lecture halls. I know the difference between a man thinking out loud and a man putting on a show. "He's just a professor," Michael said. "Honestly, he's been irrelevant for 20 years. I'm going to walk into that interview, and they're not going to care what his name is. They're going to care what I've built." There was a pause. I kept my pen moving. "He thinks the old way is the right way. That's the whole problem with him." I'm going to prove I don't need any of it, not his name, not his contacts, not his advice. I'll get there on my own." Another pause. Then he laughed, and the laugh was the kind that's meant to be heard. I set my pen down, not because I was upset I wasn't. Not exactly, but because I wanted to be precise about what I had just heard. I took out a small notebook from the drawer beside me, the kind I've kept in every office and every kitchen since I was a graduate student, and I wrote down the date, the time, and a summary of what Michael had said. 3 sentences, no commentary, just the record. That was the first entry. The following week, I called an old friend, a man named David Okafor, who had been practicing law in Cambridge for over 2 decades and who I'd known since we were both young men arguing about contract theory over bad coffee. I asked him a specific question: what were the rules in Massachusetts around recording a conversation? David was quiet for a moment, the way he always is before he says something precise. Then he said, "Massachusetts is a 2-party consent state for wiretapping, but the case law on personal recording is more nuanced. If you're a party to the conversation and you're the one recording, there are circumstances under which that's legally defensible. Are you asking because you're planning to record someone?" I told him I was asking because I wanted to understand my options. He was quiet again. Then, "Richard, if Michael says something in your home and you're present and you make a record of it, the legal exposure is low, but you should know what you're doing and why." I told him I always did. The next month, I had a small device installed in the living room, not hidden in any dramatic sense, just positioned on the bookshelf behind a row of engineering texts that Michael had never once pulled from the shelf. The camera was no larger than a smoke detector. A former student of mine, a young woman named Elena Reyes, who now ran a home security consulting firm in Somerville, handled the installation in under an hour. She asked me no questions I didn't want to answer, which is one of the reasons I'd called her specifically. 3 weeks after the installation, Elena stopped by on a Tuesday morning under the pretext of a routine check. She pulled up the footage on her tablet, scrolled through it without a word, then set it on the counter and looked at me. She was 31 years old and had spent 6 years doing security work before she started her own firm, and she was not given to unnecessary commentary. "Professor Alderton," she said, "the audio on all 3 files is clean. Timestamps are embedded and uneditable. If you ever need this to hold up somewhere, it will hold up." She picked up her tablet and left. I wrote the date in the notebook. Over the following months, I recorded 3 conversations of consequence. The first was in October. Michael was sitting on the couch with his laptop open, talking to someone I later identified as a friend from his graduate program. He said, "My father is a failure who got lucky with tenure. That's all it is. Tenure is just the university's way of protecting mediocrity." He laughed again. Same laugh as before. The second was in December, the week before Christmas. He was on the phone, pacing near the window, and he said, "I don't need a reference from him. His name doesn't open any doors that matter anymore. The people I'm talking to have never heard of him." He said it with the confidence of a man who has decided a fact is true because it is convenient. The third was in February, and it was the one I kept coming back to. He was quieter that time, not performing, actually thinking, and he said, "I just need to get the offer first. Once I have the offer, none of it matters. Once I'm in, I'm in." He paused. "He can't touch me once I'm in." I noted the date on all 3 recordings and filed them in the folder on my desk. The email I found by accident, or as close to accident as anything gets when you're paying attention. Michael had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter in March of the previous year, not this year, but 2 years prior, and a notification had come through from his university account. I wasn't reading his correspondence. I happened to see the sender's name because it was a name I recognized. A student of mine from 3 semesters back, a careful young man named Owen Park, who had taken my graduate seminar in systems design. Owen had been one of the better students I'd taught in recent years, methodical, honest, the kind of engineer who checks his assumptions twice. The subject line read, "Read the assignment." I didn't read the full thread at the time, but I remembered it, and when, 6 months later, I had reason to look more carefully at Michael's academic record, the record he had submitted as part of his application to the firm. I contacted Owen directly. Owen was now working at a lab in Kendall Square. We met for coffee. He was polite and uncomfortable in equal measure, which told me most of what I needed to know before he said anything. What he told me was this: Michael had asked him to explain a block of code for a project in their shared seminar. Owen had declined to simply give him the answer, but offered to walk through the logic together. Michael had said he understood. The project was submitted 2 days later. Owen had recognized the structure, not identical, but close enough that he'd looked up the source. It was a repository on GitHub, a public one, with a license that required attribution. Michael's submission had no attribution. Owen said, "I didn't report it. I should have. I thought maybe I was wrong." I told him he hadn't been wrong. He asked me what I was going to do with it. I told him I hadn't decided yet. That was mostly true. What I had decided was that I would keep it the way you keep a piece of information that you don't know the shape of yet, but you know belongs to the record. The folder on my desk had grown over 8 months from a single page to 23 transcripts, dates, the 3 video files on a USB drive, Owen's written account, and the GitHub repository with its original commit history intact. I kept it in the filing cabinet under a label that said "Load Calculations," which was accurate in its way. Every structure has a point at which the accumulated weight becomes relevant. I had been measuring the weight. I had not yet decided when to apply it. There were transcripts, dates, the 3 video files on a USB drive, Owen's account in writing which he'd agreed to provide, and a copy of the GitHub repository with its original commit history intact, time-stamped 2 days before Michael's submission. I hadn't built this because I knew what was coming. I'd built it because I had learned, in 31 years of teaching engineering, that you do not wait for a structure to fail before you understand its load-bearing points. You study it while it is still standing. You map the stress fractures before the fracture becomes a collapse. Michael had been telling me, for 8 months, exactly who he was. He had told me in the living room, and on the phone, and in the emails he'd left open, and in the way he'd looked at me at dinner and said nothing because he'd decided I wasn't worth the effort of a real conversation. I had listened to all of it. I had written it down. I had kept the record. That is what preparation looks like. Not a plan with a specific ending in mind, just the discipline to pay attention and the patience to wait until the moment when attention becomes relevant. The folder sat on my desk. The problem sets were finished. Outside. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in April, and somewhere across the city, my son was preparing for an interview he believed would change everything. He was right about that part. Michael called Harrington Engineering at 8:47 on Wednesday morning. I know the time because James told Sarah, and Sarah told me 3 days later, her voice careful and flat in the way it gets when she's trying to report something without editorializing. He had rehearsed, apparently. James said Michael spent Tuesday night working through what he would say, acknowledging the incident, framing it as a learning experience, positioning himself as someone who had grown. It was a reasonable approach. If the only thing on the table had been a single incident from 2 years ago, it might have worked. Michael was articulate when he wanted to be. He knew how to present himself. The HR director's name was Carol Briggs. She had been in workforce development at Harrington for 14 years, and she picked up on the second ring. Michael said what he had prepared. He said the thesis situation had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment during a high-pressure semester, something he had learned from, something that no longer reflected who he was. He said he understood if the company had concerns, but he wanted the opportunity to address them directly. He said he was committed to integrity in his professional work. Carol Briggs let him finish. Then she said, "Michael, Dr. Chen sent us a documentation package. I want to be honest with you. What we received isn't consistent with what you're describing." Michael asked what she meant. She said, "It's not just one mistake. It's a pattern." There was a silence on the line. James was not in the room for this call, but Michael told him about it afterward, in enough detail that the account reached Sarah with the specific words, "intact." A pattern. That was the phrase that stopped him. Michael asked her to explain. Carol Briggs said, "We received recordings of phone conversations in which you discussed falsifying attribution. We received emails from classmates describing similar situations in other courses. And we received a second academic integrity file from your first year, a coding assignment where you submitted work from an open-source repository without attribution or disclosure." Michael said that was a misunderstanding. He said the open-source issue was a common gray area, that everyone did it, that the professor had never formally cited it as a violation. Carol Briggs said, "The professor filed an internal note at the time. It didn't go to the dean's office, but it's in the record." Michael said, "How did anyone get access to internal notes from my first year?" Carol Briggs said she wasn't in a position to discuss the source of the documentation. She said she was sorry, but Harrington Engineering would be withdrawing his application. She said she hoped he would find a position that was a good fit, and she meant it in the way people mean things when they are trying to be kind while delivering news that cannot be softened. The call lasted 11 minutes. Michael sat with his phone for a while after that. James found him in the kitchen of their apartment, standing at the counter, not making coffee, just standing. James asked what happened. Michael said the company pulled his application as James asked why. Michael said, "My father sent them a documentation package." James said, "What kind of documentation?" Michael said, "Everything." He called me that afternoon. I was in my office at the university between my 11 o'clock section and a department meeting at 2. The call came in at 12:18. I let it ring through to voicemail. He called again at 12:23. I let that one go too. The third call came at 12:31, and I answered it. He said, "I need to understand what you did." I said, "I think you already understand it." He said, "You sent them recordings. You sent them emails. You sent them a file from my first year that was never even formally cited. Where did you get all of that?" I said, "I paid attention." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For how long?" I said, "Long enough." That was the extent of what I told him on that call. He asked several more questions, and I answered very few of them. He raised his voice once, then lowered it. By the end, he sounded less angry than exhausted, which was something I recognized. It is what anger sounds like when it runs into something it cannot move. He called his mother that evening. Ellen and I have been divorced for 9 years, and we maintain a civil relationship for the sake of the children, which in practice means we speak 3 or 4 times a year and do not involve ourselves in each other's daily lives. She called me the following morning to tell me about the conversation, which she did because she felt I should know, and because she is a fair-minded woman even when she is unhappy with me. She said Michael had cried. She said he told her he didn't understand why I had done it, that all he had wanted was to embarrass me in front of people, to make a point, and that he hadn't expected it to go this far. Ellen said she had listened to all of it. Then she said, "Michael, you made a choice about how to treat your father. He made a choice about what to do with what he knew. Those are 2 separate choices, and you only own one of them." Michael said, "He destroyed my career before it started." Ellen said, "Your career was built on something that wasn't solid. That's not something he did to you." Michael said, "Whose side are you on?" Ellen said, "I'm on the side of you eventually understanding what happened here." She told me Michael had gone quiet after that. She said she didn't know what else to tell him, that she was not going to pretend he hadn't done something serious, but that she also wasn't going to pretend I hadn't been cold about it. She said, "Richard, you could have talked to him." I said, "I tried to talk to him for 3 years." She said, "I know." We stayed on the line for another minute without saying much. Before she hung up, she said, "He's going to need time to figure out who he actually is." I told her I hoped he got there. I meant it. Sarah called me that evening. She was quieter than she'd been at the graduation, more careful with her words. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was. She asked if I had known this was going to happen when Michael tore up the diploma. I said I had known something was going to happen. I said I hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. She said, "He's my brother, Dad." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know how to feel about any of this." I told her she didn't have to know yet. I told her that was a reasonable place to be. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a while. The folder was still on the desk, the original one, the physical copy, the one I had assembled over 8 months of paying attention to my son. Most of its contents had already been transmitted electronically. The paper version was redundant now. I left it where it was. Outside, Cambridge was doing what Cambridge does in late April, cold in the morning, something almost warm by afternoon, the kind of weather that can't quite commit. I had a department meeting in an hour. I had papers to return on Friday. Michael had a phone that kept ringing with questions he didn't have answers to yet. That was Wednesday. The call came on a Thursday morning. Dr. Patricia Chen's office occupied the northeast corner of Whitmore Hall, a room I had been in twice before, both times for faculty committee work, never for anything like this. She had been dean of the engineering school for 11 years. I knew her the way you know a colleague you respect from a distance by her work, by her decisions, by the way she ran a room. When I had contacted her in February, I had not asked for a favor. I had presented documentation and let her draw her own conclusions. She had drawn them carefully, and she had not called me back until she was certain of what she was looking at. She called Michael at 9:14 on Thursday morning. He was in his apartment in Alston, 4 miles from the campus where he had spent 4 years learning, or pretending to. James told me later that Michael had been in the middle of breakfast when the call came, that he had looked at the screen, seen the university's main number, and answered it with the particular confidence of a young man who does not yet understand that institutions can move faster than he can. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. Dr. Chen asked him to come in that afternoon. She did not tell him why. She did not need to. Michael arrived at Whitmore Hall at 2 o'clock. He wore the same blazer he had worn to Sarah's graduation dinner. I noticed this later from the description James gave me, and I noted it without comment. He had dressed for something he expected to manage. He had dressed for a conversation he thought he could steer. Dr. Chen's assistant, a woman named Elaine Fortis, who had worked in that office for 14 years, showed him in. Elaine told me afterward that he had smiled at her when he walked past. She had not smiled back. She had worked in academic administration long enough to recognize the difference between a meeting and a reckoning. Dr. Chen was standing when he entered. She did not sit until he did. She set a folder on the desk between them. Not my folder, her folder, the one she had assembled from the materials I had provided. She had organized it herself. That was important to me. I had given her the evidence. She had evaluated it, verified it, and reached her own conclusions. Whatever happened in that room was hers, not mine. Michael, she said, I've received information from someone I trust a great deal. This person provided me with detailed documentation regarding academic integrity concerns related to your time here. She paused. I want to give you the opportunity to respond before I explain what happens next. Michael asked who. Dr. Chen said, Your father, Dr. Richard. James told me later that Michael had called him immediately after leaving the building, that his voice had been different, flatter, stripped of the particular texture it usually carried. James said Michael told him that his first thought, sitting across from Dr. Chen, was that it was impossible, that his father was a professor at another university, that he had no standing at this one, that he had no access, no leverage, no reason to have done anything except sit quietly and absorb what had been done to him at his daughter's graduation dinner. That was the assumption Michael had been operating on for 8 months, that I was a man who absorbed things. He's lying, Michael said to Dr. Chen. He's doing this because I destroyed his diploma. He wants revenge. He has no standing here. He doesn't even teach at this university. Dr. Chen looked at him for a moment without expression. Then she said, He doesn't need standing here. Michael, he needed the truth. He had that for 2 years before you gave him a reason to use it. She opened the folder. Dr. Chen opened the folder. She turned it so he could see the first page. Your father provided this documentation in February, she said, 2 months before your sister's graduation. The timestamps on these materials go back 26 months. There are recordings. There are emails. There are assignment files with metadata that places them outside any window in which you could have authored them yourself. She turned to the next page. None of this was created in response to what happened at the dinner. All of it predates that evening by a significant margin. Michael looked at the papers. He was very careful, very intelligent. Those were Dr. Chen's words, though she was not speaking about Michael when she said them. She was explaining what she had thought when she first reviewed what I had sent her. She had said in our February meeting that she had rarely seen documentation assembled with that degree of precision. I had told her that I had spent 34 years teaching engineering students how to build things that do not fail. The principle, I said, applied broadly. The color, James told me, went out of Michael's face in stages, not all at once. The way a room goes dark when the sun moves behind a cloud gradually, and then completely. I didn't know he could do this. Michael said, the words, as James reported them, were not angry. They were something closer to bewildered. He's just a professor. Dr. Chen closed the folder. Your father is not just a professor, Michael. He is a very careful man and a very intelligent one. He waited until you did something in public before he acted. I think he wanted to make sure that what he brought to me could not be attributed to private grievance. He made it impossible to dismiss. That sentence took me a long time to understand when James relayed it to me. Not because it was unclear, but because it was more precise than I had been with myself about what I had done and why. I had told myself, over 8 months, that I was assembling documentation because it was the right thing to do, because academic fraud is a specific harm, because it devalues the work of every student who does not commit it, because the degree Michael was about to receive meant something to the institution that granted it and to the profession that would receive him. All of that was true. But Dr. Chen was also right. I had waited. I had waited until he stood up in front of 30 people and held my diploma over his head. I had waited until there was a room full of witnesses who had seen what he was willing to do. And then I had acted. He had given me the public moment. I had given Dr. Chen everything else. I'm required to report this to the Academic Integrity Board, Dr. Chen told him. You will not be permitted to complete your degree requirements while the investigation is pending. That process typically takes between 60 and 90 days. She looked at him steadily. I have also been in contact with several of the firms where you submitted applications. They were informed that an academic integrity investigation was underway. It was my professional obligation to do so. Michael stood up. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Dr. Chen had been thorough, and thoroughness does not leave gaps for argument. He walked to the door. Elaine was at her desk outside, and she looked up when he came through, and he did not look at her. He walked down the corridor of Whitmore Hall and pushed through the door at the end of it. And there, in the hallway just outside, on the wooden bench that sat against the wall beneath a window that faced the courtyard, I was sitting. I had a book open, Lamb's Structural Analysis Text, the 4th edition, which I had been meaning to reread for 2 years. I had arrived 40 minutes earlier and found the bench and sat down, and I had been reading. And when the door opened and Michael came through it, I looked up. We looked at each other for a moment. His face was the face of someone who has just understood something he cannot undo. Not rage, not grief, exactly. Something more fundamental than either the particular expression of a person realizing that the world is structured differently than he believed it to be. I looked at him. Then I looked back at my book. He waited. I turned a page. He left. I heard his footsteps go down the stairwell, and then I heard the exterior door, and then there was nothing but the building's usual sounds, the hum of the HVAC, someone's office phone 3 doors down, the particular silence of a Thursday afternoon in a building full of people doing careful work. I finished the chapter. Then I closed the book, stood up, and walked back to my car. The first rejection email arrived that Friday. Meridian Systems sent it at 11:22 in the morning, a form letter, but with a single additional sentence that had been inserted above the standard closing. We have been made aware of concerns regarding academic integrity that affect our ability to proceed with your application. James forwarded it to me without comment. He had been copied on a chain Michael had started, looking for advice, and James had quietly, without drama, stepped back from that chain and sent me the email instead. That was the first domino. Hargrove Engineering sent theirs on Monday. Same language, slightly different phrasing. Their legal team had evidently reviewed the wording more carefully. The third came from a firm in Cambridge, the one that had been Michael's first choice, the one he had mentioned to me the previous Christmas, with the particular brightness of someone who has already decided the outcome. Their letter was the shortest, 3 sentences. The last one said, "We wish you well in resolving the matter." The fourth was not a letter. It was a phone call. James was in the kitchen of their apartment when it happened. He told me about it later, without being asked, because he thought I should know the shape of it. Michael had the phone on speaker, the way he did when he was confident about a call. The name on the screen was Carol Briggs, from Harrington Engineering. James said Michael sat up straight when he answered, the same posture he used in interviews, shoulders back, voice calibrated to project ease. Carol Briggs said, "Michael, I want to be straightforward with you. We received the documentation package from Dr. Chen's office yesterday. We've reviewed it. We won't be moving forward." Michael said, "Carol, if you'll let me explain the context." She said, "It's not one incident. Michael, that's the difficulty. It's a pattern across multiple courses and multiple years." "I'm sorry." James said the word pattern hit Michael the same way it had hit him in Dr. Chen's office, not like an accusation, but like a door closing. Michael said, very quietly, "I understand." He thanked her. He hung up. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. James said Michael set the phone face down on the counter and stood there, looking at the wall. Then he said, without turning around, "He sent them everything." James said, "I know." Michael said, "He had it all. He had all of it." James didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The breadbasket was still between them, in some form, and they both knew it. By the following Thursday, 3 weeks after Dr. Chen's meeting, Michael had received 5 rejection letters, all from firms in the Boston area, all citing the same concern in language that varied only in its degree of formality. The Academic Integrity Board had not yet issued a finding. The investigation was still underway, but the information was out. And in the engineering sector in this city, information moves along networks that are older and more reliable than any formal process. Michael's name was not on a list. There is no list. What there is, instead, is a community of professionals who have worked together for decades, who share hiring committees and conference panels and university advisory boards, and who make decisions based on information that arrives through channels that do not require documentation. I had spent 34 years building relationships inside that community. I had not called in favors. I had not asked anyone to act. I had provided accurate information to Dr. Chen, who had provided accurate information to the firms, who had made their own decisions. That is how it works when the information is true. James called me on a Friday evening, 3.5 weeks after the meeting in Whitmore Hall. He was not calling to report he was calling because he had been Michael's friend for 4 years and was trying to understand what had happened. He asked me directly, had I known, when I sat down at Sarah's graduation dinner, that this was coming. I told him I had known for 8 months that something was coming. I had not known exactly when. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He thought you were going to do nothing." He said that to me, after. He said he knew you'd be upset, but that you wouldn't do anything because you never do anything. I told James I appreciated him telling me that. After we hung up, I sat in my office. The structural analysis text was on the corner of my desk. Outside, Cambridge was moving into early May, the trees fully out now, the light staying longer, the particular quality of a New England spring that always arrives later than you expect, and then, briefly, is exactly right. Michael had been very certain about what I would do. He had been certain for a long time, probably certain that I was the kind of man who absorbed things and moved on. Certain that 30 years of classroom patience translated into 30 years of personal passivity, certain that a father who does not shout is a father who does not act. He had built his certainty carefully, over years, and he had been wrong about every part of it. I picked up the structural analysis text and found my page. 6 months passed the way semesters pass, not slowly, not quickly, but in increments you only notice when you look back at them. The structural analysis course ended in late May. The summer intensive started in July. By September, I had a new cohort of first-year graduate students who did not know my name yet and would spend the first 3 weeks deciding whether to be afraid of me or simply cautious. Michael was living with his mother in Brookline. I knew this not because she told me we had not spoken since the night of Sarah's graduation, when she had called and said things I understood and did not argue with, but because Sarah told me, in the careful way she had learned to tell me things she was uncertain I wanted to hear. She said it on a Sunday afternoon in late August, sitting at my kitchen table with both hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. She said Michael was working at a hardware store in Newton. She said he was not sleeping well. She said he had stopped talking about engineering. I listened. I did not say anything until she was finished. "Is he all right?" I asked. "He's not all right," she said, "but I think he's starting to understand something." I nodded and refilled her tea. The hardware store was not a punishment I had arranged. I want to be precise about that. The consequences that followed the call from Dr. Chen's office had their own momentum. The letter from Hargrove Engineering, the subsequent inquiries from 2 other firms Michael had applied to, the way professional networks in a city like Boston move information faster than people expect. None of that was something I had engineered beyond the initial conversation with Patricia Chen. I had made one call. What followed was the natural weight of what Michael had done pressing down on a surface that could not hold it. That is the thing about structural failures. They are rarely caused by a single force. They are caused by a design that could not sustain the load it was asked to carry. Michael had built something, a professional identity, a set of claims, a particular story about himself and his capabilities that could not sustain honest scrutiny. Dr. Chen's call had simply been the scrutiny. James Whitfield got the position at Hargrove in late June. He called to tell me, which I had not expected. He was formal about it in the way young people are formal when they are trying to express something they do not quite have the language for yet. He said he wanted me to know. He said he had thought a great deal about what he had seen at the graduation dinner and about the conversation we had had afterward in the parking lot. And he had made some decisions about how he intended to conduct himself professionally. He said he hoped that was all right. I told him it was more than all right. He ran into Michael sometime in September at a coffee shop near Cleveland Circle. Sarah mentioned it to me later. She said James had told Michael about the job and that Michael had sat very quietly for a long time without responding. She said James had told Michael that he thought Richard, she quoted James directly, which I appreciated, had done something difficult and correct, and that he was grateful for it. Michael had not said anything. He had just listened. There is a particular quality to that kind of listening. I recognized it when Sarah described it, because I had seen it in students before, the moment when something settles into a person not as information, but as understanding. Information can be argued with. Understanding cannot. You cannot unlearn the thing you have finally grasped in your own body. In October, I received an email from an address I did not recognize at first. It took me a moment to understand that it was Michael, using an account I had not seen before. The subject line was blank. The message was 4 sentences. He said he knew he had been wrong. He said he knew he had done it to himself. He said he was sorry. He said he did not expect a response. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went to teach the afternoon seminar on load distribution in composite materials. The students had a problem set due, and 3 of them had questions about their assumptions. And I spent 40 minutes working through the errors with them at the whiteboard. The errors were interesting ones, not careless, but based on a misunderstanding of how forces transfer across interfaces, the kind of errors that are worth making, because understanding why they are wrong teaches you something you cannot learn from getting it right on the first attempt. I responded to Michael 2 days later. I thought about what to write for most of those 2 days, not continuously, but in the intervals between other things, between lectures, between office hours, During the 20-minute walk home along the river on a Tuesday evening, when the water was the particular gray-silver color it gets in New England autumn. I wrote, "I know you know, that is why I did it. I wanted you to learn from the mistake itself, not from a warning about it. Warnings can be dismissed. Consequences cannot. You have learned something now that I could not have taught you in any other way. That is all that matters." I did not write that I forgave him, because forgiveness was not what the moment required. I did not write that I was proud of him, because pride would have been premature and he would have known it. I wrote what was true, and I sent it, and I did not wait by the inbox for a reply. He did not respond immediately. When he did respond, a week later, it was one sentence. He said, "I think I understand what you meant about integrity now." I read that sentence, and then I set the phone down on my desk and looked out the window at the courtyard below, where two graduate students were walking together through the fallen leaves, both of them carrying the particular posture of people engaged in an argument that is also a collaboration. I watched them for a moment. Then I picked up the phone and went back to work. Michael did not come back to Boston professionally. By the following spring, he had moved to Pittsburgh, where he found a position with a smaller civil engineering firm, not the kind of firm he had imagined, not the kind of salary, not the kind of trajectory, but a position earned in the ordinary way, with an application that did not require anything to be invented or borrowed or falsified. Sarah told me he had started sleeping better. She told me he had started talking about the work itself, not about where the work would take him. I taught the spring semester. I taught the fall semester. The cohort of first-year graduate students who had not known my name in September knew it well by December, and most of them had arrived at cautious rather than afraid, which is the right outcome. On the first day of the structural analysis survey, I told them what I tell every cohort at the beginning. Integrity is not a choice you make once and then possess. It is a load-bearing element. It is present in every joint, every connection, every interface where one thing meets another. When it fails at any point, the failure does not stay local. It distributes. It finds the next weak connection and the next until the whole structure has to account for what was not built correctly at the beginning. They wrote it down. They always write it down on the first day, before they know which things will matter. I never mentioned Michael in those lectures. There was no reason to, or the lesson was not about him. The last time I saw my son in person that year, it was a brief thing, Sarah's birthday dinner in November, a restaurant in Cambridge she had chosen, a table of 6 that included her roommate and 2 friends from her program. Michael came up from Pittsburgh for the weekend. He sat across from me for most of the meal. We talked about Sarah, about her work, about the winter coming. We talked the way people talk when they are rebuilding something carefully, testing each connection before putting weight on it. He did not apologize again. I did not expect him to. The email had been enough, and we both understood that. When the dinner ended and we were standing outside on the sidewalk in the November cold, waiting for cabs to arrive, Michael looked at me for a moment and then looked away. He said quietly that he hoped I was doing well. I told him I was. The cab came. He got in. I watched it pull into traffic, and then I turned up my collar against the wind and walked the 6 blocks back to my car, past the lit windows of the other restaurants, past the last of the October leaves still caught in the iron fence along the park, past the particular amber glow of a city that does not stop moving just because one small thing inside it has finally come to rest. I drove home on the same roads I had driven for 23 years. The heat in the car came up slowly, the way it always does in November. I did not turn on the radio. If you've ever watched something you built a degree, a name, a life's quiet dignity, get treated like it meant nothing, and then held your silence anyway because you understood that silence, used correctly, is not weakness but architecture, then you already know exactly what that November walk felt like. These are the stories I keep finding worth telling. If they find something true in you, I'll be here.